Okay, so now we're at the point with the oil pump out of the way that we can start replacing our rod bearings. Now, one thing I forgot to mention, and we can put this at the beginning, using this method, it's important that cylinder number 1 is close to bottom dead center, like this. That is because what we're going to do is we're going to replace rod bearings on cylinder 1, reinstall our oil pump, and then from there we'll be able to bar the engine over again. Without the oil pump in place, this sprocket will jam up in the timing guide and will prevent you from rotating the engine over. So we're going to do cylinder number 1, put the oil pump back in, and then we can do cylinders 2 through 6. But with that said, we're going to go ahead and remove our rod bearing cap here on cylinder 1. It's going to be E12 for the rod cap bolts. So there's our bottom bearing, which is always going to have the least amount of wear because it's the non-loaded side, but it looks pretty phenomenal for 160,000 miles. So I think we might end up dispelling the myth of N55 rod bearing wear. Mind you, this is on a 135, so earlier N55s, which are more known to have oiling problems and possible rod bearing issues. This is already a really good sign. Now we're going to push the piston up over the crank journal. That'll give us access to our top bearing, which also looks fantastic, by the way. A little bit of wear, but for 160,000 miles, that is really great. I don't feel any scoring or any grooves. And these are factory bearings, so they haven't been replaced. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and install our new ACL bearings. These do not have a top or bottom like the factory bearings do. We will talk about that in depth a little bit later. But I'm just going to pop this bearing in right now. These are the standard clearance ACLs. They do make a extra oil clearance variation. I don't particularly see the need for that in this application. So what I'm doing right now is just making sure that that bearing is properly seated in the connecting rod, which it is. So I'll push it back up and onto our crank journal, being very careful not to touch the crank journal. We don't want to scratch it or mar it. Using plastic gauge PG1, it's the green plastic gauge. We're just going to do a quick check on clearances. BMW gives you a window with plastic gauge as a quick sanity check, so we're going to make sure the new bearings are within that tolerance. I'm sure they will be, but I always do this on rod bearings just as a quick check. And for this check, I'm going to be reusing the old rod bolts. When I go to reinstall this with the bearings lubricated, I will use new rod bolts and those will be oiled, but this is just for a clearance check. So no lubrication on this installation, and we're reusing the old rod bolts for the check. All right, our set torque is 20 Newton meters. And then we need to go 70 degrees, followed by another 70 degrees of rotation. Now we'll take the rod bolts back off. It's got a nice little stripe there, which we will clean off, and we need to be between 25 thousandths and 76 thousandths of a mil. We're pretty much square in the middle at 51 thousandths, so more than within spec. And again, this is not a perfect measurement, but this is just as a quick sanity check to make sure the new bearings that you're putting in are within tolerance. And BMW typically uses the green PG1 plastic gauge for this. Our schmoo of the day for installation purposes is Liqui Moly LM48 installation paste. This is really just going to be used for startup to make sure that these bearings have some lubrication. We are going to prime this engine, of course, which we will have a full video on how to prime an N55 after these types of repairs. Very important that you follow that procedure. And also with any kind of assembly lube, once the engine starts, this stuff is going to get washed out pretty quickly. It's going to mix with the engine oil. It can't thin out the engine oil, so it's a good idea to do an oil change relatively quickly. And that also give you an indication if there's any wear material or anything like that in the engine as well. So now we're using the brand new rod bolts. Now, one thing that BMW does mention is to wash the bolts, which is use some denatured alcohol for that. That removes any kind of oil or grease or contamination. And then BMW also wants you to oil the bolts, so I put a little bit of just engine oil on them. That's going to help act as lubrication and prevent any kind of galling or resistance when I'm torquing the bolts down. All right, so first step again, 20 Newton meters. Followed by 2 rotations of 70 degrees. Okay, so now that we have number 1 done, we're gonna reinstall the oil pump so that we can bar over the rest of the engine. I'll actually probably skip to number 6 after that, just to get that, since that is already bottom dead center, and then we'll skip around between which cylinders at which point. So next step, get the oil pump back in. Okay, so to get this sprocket to line up with our pump, I'm gonna loosely thread the oil pump sprocket bolt in. This is a new one. That'll kind of help guide the pump into the sprocket. It has sprung up just a little bit. Woo! We have our new oil pump bolts. These come with the kit, which also does the windage tray and the suction tube. But these are aluminum screws, so they're one-time use only. There's 3 different sizes, and they only go in one location. So our super long bolt is going to be here on the front left of the engine, front right if you're facing the engine from the front. We have a shorter M8 bolt. That's going to go here to the front right side of the engine, or front left as you're facing it. Now, also make sure that the oil pump is sitting on the dowels. And then we have a medium-sized bolt, which goes here in the rear. There's 2 bolts that come in the kit that you're not going to end up using. This is for the oil pump chain drive module. There's 4 of these E10 Torx bolts. You're only going to use 2. They go here in front of the pump. I'm going to torque these last, but I'm going to get these inserted first and threaded by hand. There is no oil pan. There is no oil pump to bed plate gasket. It just sits against the bottom of the engine. Torque spec on our oil pump to bed plate bolts is 10 Newton meters plus 180 degrees of rotation. We'll start with the 10 Newton meters, and then we will go around and do the torque angle. And now we'll do our 180 degrees of rotation. And then for the oil pump chain guide and drive module, it's 4 Newton meters as our initial torque, and then we have to do 45 degrees of rotation. And these are E10s. Next we'll do our oil pump sprocket, which is 20 Newton meters plus 45 degrees. All right, so there was a lot that happens during this oil pump installation. Number 1, in this method, which does not involve touching any of the oil pump chain module stuff, it is important to make sure that when you remove the oil pump that you do not move its orientation. You want the keyway to stay the same way that it is when you removed it, And then when I go to put it back in, what I did is I lined up the input shaft on the pump with the hole in the sprocket, used the oil pump sprocket bolt to kind of keep it all lined up. Got that portion engaged, was able to get the oil pump in at an angle past the dowels on the engine block, and then from there, pried down very gently on the oil pump sprocket to slip it back in place on the oil pump. And then after that, went ahead and installed all the bolts, torqued everything down to spec. Now there is a special counter hold tool for the oil pump sprocket. Unfortunately, it was on back order at this point. We could not wait for it. So I was able to get the torque on that bolt. However, if you choose to do that without the special tool, just be extremely careful, be very methodical about your movements, and that's pretty much it. So this is the way to do this without getting too involved or getting inside the engine too much, and this method works out perfectly fine. So we know that you really couldn't see anything on cylinder number 1, so we're gonna show you everything here on cylinder number 6, and we'll show you the whole process of plastic gauging, how to put the bearings in, all that kind of good stuff. So here's our bottom bearing. Little score mark there, but I don't feel anything with my fingernails, so I'm not gonna worry about that. Let's see what that upper bearing looks like now. We'll just push the connecting rod off, make sure it clears the rod journal, and then we'll pull the piston down a skosh. I'll pop the bearing out, and that upper bearing looks pretty good. Similar scoring as the bottom, but very little wear, which is, we're looking good. Okay, so on the plastic gauge check, we're not going to use any kind of assembly lube. What we will do is install the bearings dry. We've already cleaned our crank journal with a lint-free shop towel. I'll install the upper bearing and the lower bearing without lube, put a piece of plastic gauge in here, and then we'll take a measurement. There's a spec that we need to be between to make sure that we have correct tolerances. Again, these are the ACL bearings. They're the tri-metal bearings. They have a little bit of a copperish tinge to them, but these are the standard clearance bearings, so not extra oil clearance or anything like that. You're not going to be able to see how I'm putting this bearing in for the upper, but I will certainly show it for the bottom, and it's pretty much the same for the uppers as well. So right there you can see the bearing. I have this tang locked into this portion here. That tang right there, when you hear about a spinning a rod bearing, it's because there's so much wear on the rod bearing that tang basically breaks away. And that is what holds the bearing in place in the connecting rod. There's gonna be another tang on the lower portion, the lower half of the connecting rod that butts up against this side here. And that keeps it locked in place when it's bolted together. So all you really need to do is just make sure that that tang is located. I like to do that first, and then you press the bearing in from the other side, and you'll kind of just feel it drop into place. And then what I do is I just push on it from the middle to make sure it's seated all the way. From there, we'll just push it back up into position. We'll move it over the top of the crank journal, and then we will drop it back into place against the crank journal like so. And now with the small end of the connecting rod here, I'll show you what I was doing on that upper portion. So what I do on these bearings is I make sure that that tang is located like so. And then all you do is you just press the bearing in with your other thumb, and then it locates it perfectly like that. And then I just kind of give it a nice firm squeeze with both thumbs, make sure that it's properly seated, but it'll look like that. And like I said, this other tang is on the opposing side, so it's on the back end of this. It just prevents everything from being able to spin. So again, when you hear spun a rod bearing, it's because the rod bearing wore so much that this tang wears away, and there's nothing to keep the bearing inside the connecting rod, and then it just spins, and then it friction welds itself to the crankshaft. And for our clearance check, I'm going to reuse the original rod bolts. They can be used for this. You don't want to use new rod bolts. And here's our green plastic gauge, PG1. I just have it sitting on the connecting rod bearing. Went ahead and cleaned down our journal on the crank. So we'll just go ahead and install it. We'll torque it down and then we'll do a clearance check. And these are fracture split rods, so they can only really go back on one way. If you wanted to mark which side went to which side, you could. But the connecting rod tangs, or the connecting rod bearing tangs, are always going to be on this side of the connecting rod. And if you do one connecting rod at a time, you're not going to mix up which was which. 20 Newton meters. And then that's followed by 2 rotations of 70 degrees. All right, there is our plastic gauge. I'll go ahead and get the gauge, which comes with the plastic gauge, to make that measurement. The BMW measurement is between 21 thousandths and 71 thousandths of a millimeter. Our gauge range here is from 25 to 76 thousandths. And all you do is just simply hold it up against the piece of wax there, and we're at 51 thousandths, which is exactly what we're on cylinder number 1. So pretty much in the middle of that range, which is perfect. That's exactly what I want to see. Now from this point, I need to clean that off, and I also need to clean off the small end rod bearing. And I also need to apply a little bit of lubrication to both bearings. So I'll just kind of push the upper big end off, and I'll put some lube on that, and then I'll clean off our crank journal, and we'll go about installing the rod cap permanently this other go around. Put a very thin layer of assembly lube here on our upper connecting rod bearing. And again, that's just for lubrication on startup. We'll also do the same to our small end. You know, you don't need to go excessive with this. A nice thin film is all you need, like so. And again, Liqui Moly LM48 installation paste is our schmoo of the day. We cleaned our rod bolts. I used denatured alcohol, and then I've also put oil on them. Depending on which connecting rod hardware you're choosing to use, whether it be ARP or some other source, always follow the instructions of the recommended lube that you should use, and then obviously follow the recommended torquing specifications. 20 Newton meters is our first step in our torque procedure. Followed by 2 rotations of 70 degrees. Yeah, now at this point, we're just gonna follow that same process for 2, 3, 4, and 5. All right, so we're at the point now where we can start buttoning up the rest of the engine. We are replacing the windage tray and oil pump pickup. Really don't think it's a good idea to put one of these back in since it is plastic. If you choose to reuse yours, put a new O-ring on it. Those are available separately. But for peace of mind, to have gone this far, invested this much, I don't know why we'd rely on a 10-year-old piece of plastic. Just using some residual oil from inside the engine, donated graciously by the oil pump here to lubricate the O-ring. And basically we're just going to slide this into place. Heard it click. We got some of our new windage tray bolts. Gonna thread these in just to hold it in position. Torque spec on our windage tray bolts is 4 Newton meters plus 90 degrees. I'll just do the set torque first, and then we'll do the torque angle after. And for what it's worth, you will have some leftover bolts out of the kit because this kit applies to other engines than just the N52, which have different quantities of bolts. So if you notice on an N55 you have some leftovers, that's okay. All right, so at this point, I'll go ahead and clean the mating surface of the bed plate. Use the plastic scraper. Fortunately, there wasn't any material left over from the oil pan that stuck to anything. So just went over it, wiped it down with a towel. Pretty simple, straightforward stuff. Don't use any kind of abrasives on it. It's a machine surface. You don't want to put any marks or grooves or anything like that into it, and there's no need to do that. I have these little holders here that are going to keep the oil pan gasket in place. You could also do it with zip ties, but these are also just as convenient. See, these little pop-ups, they just keep the oil pan gasket up in place, and then I'm going to slide the oil pan up and they'll do the same thing. And then I can start inserting some of the bolts. So at this point, the oil pan gasket are lined up and hanging here. So I'm gonna go ahead and start installing our shorter oil pan bolts. These are aluminum, one-time use, and they're all torqued to yield. So this is gonna take a while. And on top of that, we also have the bell housing bolts that we're gonna replace here at the back. Those 3 that we removed, the E10s. But what I like to do is get all the oil pan bolts in loosely. Get them all started by hand. Obviously make sure that they're all the correct size bolts. And then from there, we will start torquing them down. There is no torquing sequence for this oil pan gasket, so we can just work around the perimeter. All right, so now that we have all of the oil pan bolts installed and also our bell housing bolts, I'm gonna torque the oil pan bolts down first. It's 8 Newton meters plus 180 degrees of rotation. So what I'm gonna do is 8 Newton meters around the perimeter, starting with this back corner, and then I'll do 180 degrees on the second pass. Now that we've gone around the perimeter and tightened all of our oil pan bolts down, we're now going to do the 3 bell housing bolts. It's E10 and 19 Newton meters. All right, so at this point, oil pan is reinstalled. Now I need to get the trans cooler lines back up on the side of the oil pan because it does attach to it. So there's 2 brackets that have to go into these little notches here in the oil pan. And then once that's in, we'll put the power steering pump back in place. So, but I'm gonna start with the cooler lines first. In this case, in the front of the engine, you just have to slide it up into position and then tighten down the nut. That will also aid us in getting the one in the back done. And it's a 10 millimeter nut. If you want to torque it, 10 Newton meters would be perfectly fine. And you know what, while we're back here, let's plug in our oil level sensor. Okay, now we're gonna go ahead and put our power steering pump back up in position. There's 2 holes in the front of the oil pan and then there's 1 on the side. I'm gonna go ahead and just get these started by hand. That'll give you enough wiggle room to line up the 2 holes on the front and the 1 hole on the side. If you tighten one of these bolts down all the way, you will never be able to line up the other holes. That's usually how that works. Torque spec on these power steering pump bolts is 38 Newton meters. All right, at this point, we have everything buttoned up that we need to button up on the oil pan. Everything's been torqued down. Now comes the fun part. We get to shove the subframe back up in here. And part of the process on that is also making sure that our steering shaft over here engages with the steering input shaft on the steering rack. We also need to make sure that the steering wheel is pointed in the straight ahead position, as well as the steering rack. We'll show you that next. So before we put the subframe back up into position, we need to make sure 2 things. Number 1, that the steering wheel is pointed in the steer ahead position. And we also need to make sure that the steering rack is preset into the steer ahead position. On the steering rack here, we have a little triangle, and then you have this piece in the casting here. I just put some paint pen on that just to mark it, but that is the steer head position. And as a quick reference check, just roughly looking at the tie rod ends, they come out to more or less the same place on the sway bar. So that is the steer head position. And to confirm, when we also looked at that, the steering coupler, where the bolt goes through, that is pointed in the down position. That is going to slip over that. And that's going to allow us to get the steering column reattached. So as I'm pushing this up into position, I'm just going to make sure that the steering shaft lines up with the steering rack, line up the bolt holes, everything will slip together, and we'll start getting everything bolted back on the car. So with that said, let's get to it. All right, so again, as I bring the subframe up, I'm just going to take a look at the steering shaft, get that to slide onto our steering rack input shaft here. Also get the 2 forward bolt holes line up for the subframe on both sides. That third bolt hole towards the rear, that should relatively self-align. It is slotted, so I'm not too worried about that. But really, just making sure that the steering rack comes together first. And then once I know that's in place, make sure the engine mount's going into the pockets here on the subframe, and just make sure everything lines up. So we have the, there's a lot of moving around you have to do, but basically steering shaft is lined up. The steering shaft bolt or steering coupler bolt has already gone through and threads have been started. And make sure that as you're pushing the subframe up into position, that the alignment dowel drops into the hole in the subframe. That is a really good indicator that you're in position. And obviously make sure it's the same way for both sides. So I got 4 of the subframe bolts started. I'm going to make sure that the forward bolts start going in, because that's actually what centers the subframe on the frame rails. There's an alignment dowel there, so I want that to be pulled in first, and then once those are pulled in, I can work on those rearward bolts. And these are E14s. I'm going to use a ratchet to slowly bring it up into position. And these rearward bolts, if you had an alignment issue, you would not be able to get these in. So again, really important that you start from the front subframe bolts, work the centers up, and then you can finally put in the rears. We will torque all these to spec here in a moment, but just make sure these bolts are bottomed out. Torque spec on our subframe bolts, all 6 of them, is 108 Newton meters. I'm going to start with the forward ones first, because like I said, those kind of locate everything. Next up, we'll put the engine mount bolts in. Torque spec for the engine mounts to the subframe, 13mm drive, 28 Newton meters. So at this point, we need to put the steering shaft bolt back in. You can get at it through the top of the subframe. There's a nice hole there, but that's an E10. Bottom it out, and then we're going to torque it to 24 Newton meters. And again, if that was not lined up appropriately, you would not be able to put the bolt through. If the bolt will not go through, that is not lined up correctly. All right, we're going to reinstall our power steering, which this is a delicate balance of feeling it and kind of getting everything positioned. Obviously make sure the original crush washers are out of the way while we install the new ones. We'll get the bolt started by hand, and then our pressure line here, which is the bigger fitting. Again, just make sure that the crush washers are on. And there are none of the original ones, and we'll get that started by hand as well. So there's 2 different torque specs to these banjo bolts. The 19mm is 30 Newton meters. The 22mm is 35 Newton meters. So at this point, what's left for us to do underneath the car is to bolt the suspension back up to the subframe. We're using new hardware for that. It's all torque to yield stuff, and the lock nuts are lock nuts, so they should be replaced. Now it's just a matter of leveraging everything back into place. The bolts for the control arms are the same. The torque specs will be the same for those. One control arm, the thrust arm, needs to be torqued at right height. Our wishbone, which has a spherical inner, we could just torque that at droop. Doesn't make a difference. So let's just rearrange everything here. Kind of get everything back to its natural habitat where it wants to be. Like so, there we go. On the subframe, we have this nut that I was saying about when we took it apart. It just has like a little hook that it hooks onto. So I'm gonna slide that into position. Nice satisfying click. Then we have our headlight level sensor arm, which the crimp just fell out when we took the car apart. So we have to replace that level sensor arm, but that's fine, that just is what it is. Put the tie rod nut on, at least to hold that in position. Both the control arm bolts are the same. They're class 8.8, which means it's 68 newton meters plus 90. I'm gonna go ahead and tighten down the ball joint nut for the tie rod end. It's a 21 millimeter nut and a 4 millimeter counter hold. Torque spec on the tie rod nut is 165 newton meters. Very awkward torquing position. Have a brand new lock nut on our sway bar end link here. It's a 16 millimeter nut. And the torque spec will be 58 newton meters. So the last thing that we need to do here with the suspension is torque our tie rod nuts to 165 newton meters. It's 21 millimeter. Okay, so now we're back up top. You'll notice that the engine support brace is no longer here. Well, it doesn't need to be because the subframe is back in with the engine mounts and everything else that is supporting the engine from underneath. So went ahead and removed that. Again, depending on which support method you're using, whether it's a 2-point brace, a 3-point, a 4-point, whatever, that installation is going to be totally dependent upon whatever method you're using to keep the engine supported. With that said, we're now at the point where we need to put the serpentine belt back in, put the fan back in, and then we also need to put oil in the engine so that we can prime it. So I'm gonna go ahead and put our serpentine belt in first. I'm gonna put a photo of the belt routing up here on the screen so you can see what that is. Of course, before you got to this point, you could always take a photo or draw your own diagram of what this looks like, but here's an image to show you what that looks like, since you're not gonna be able to see how I'm routing it anyway. Yeah. Now you might remember earlier in the video I put a Allen wrench in there, but I actually found the tensioner pin. I always kind of carry one with me, or I carry a collection of them with me when I know I'm working on a car, and I was able to find the right one, so I just swapped that out at one point. But the key is when you put any serpentine belt in, make sure that all of the ribs are sitting in the grooves on the pulleys, make sure it's not caught up on anything. Just check all that up front, and then that'll save you hassle just in case one of them is a little bit off. But having the tensioner in a locked position makes that process a lot easier because you're not fighting the tensioner while you're trying to route the belt. So at this point, we're gonna go ahead and reinstall our fan and fan shroud. I would say that installation is the reverse of removal, except not. We just really need to make sure it's not catching anything on the way down or pushing anything. Most notably, you need to make sure that the trans cooler below does not get pushed down because it is held onto the radiator by a plastic connector on the hose, and we don't want to break that. So just being really diligent about our movements here and getting this thing down into position. Of course, the AC hoses are in the way because they just are. The only thing helping us now is gravity. We're going to reinstall that 10 millimeter screw, which secures the fan to the radiator. Like I said, this is an aftermarket radiator, so that's not what would traditionally be holding this in place, but that's what is used to hold this radiator in place. We also need to go back down below to re-secure the transmission cooler to the fan shroud. One thing to note, the connection at the radiator, which is a quick disconnect fitting, if it moves side to side, it might drip a little bit of coolant. If you see that happening, don't worry about that too much. As long as it's seated squarely, it won't leak, which that's in a normal situation. Like I said, we're just gonna tighten that 10mm screw down. We'll take our expansion tank hose next, clip it back to our fan shroud like so, and then we'll take our electrical connector and plug it into the fan shroud. Might just zip tie the wiring harness up over here afterwards. There's some indication that's the way it should be. So we'll zip tie that afterwards. It's not a big deal. I'm gonna lift the car up now, and I'm going to re-secure that transmission cooler to the fan shroud. All right, now we need to re-secure our trans cooler to the fan shroud. Now you notice that the fan shroud does not meet this aftermarket intercooler. And part of that is because this thing has been spaced down substantially. Not sure why that is, but that's going to be something that we're going to address after the fact. So anybody watching this video who's like, that's a problem, yes, I'm aware. And yes, I'm going to see if I can fix that. But for the sake of this video, we're just going to re-secure our trans cooler back to the fan shroud. And that is a T25 screw, BTW. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and put oil in the engine. I already put a brand new oil filter in when we first drained the oil, so that's all set to go. The drain plug on the oil pan was already torqued. We did that after we drained the oil. So really at this point, it's sort of like an oil change, except not really, because after we put oil in this, where we are right now in this process, we're going to prime the engine before we start it. That is a very critical procedure on the N55. Now, while BMW doesn't have a service bulletin that points to the N55 specifically needing this procedure done, that priming procedure came due to N55s failing after oil filter housing gasket replacements, vinyl sprocket replacements, oil pan gasket replacements, oil pump replacements, pretty much anything that involved opening up the oiling system at a major level. So in this case, since we replaced the rod bearings, the crankshaft itself has oil passages through it. We've completely removed all the connecting rods, put new bearings in. We also removed the oil pump. Oil pan came off. So in this case, we did a pretty intrusive repair on this engine. It's gonna be super critical to make sure that we prime this engine, make sure it has oil pressure before we start it. That way, this engine has every chance at living another 160,000 miles, which is what we want. So, with that said, we're gonna fill it with oil. And then we're not going to show you the prime procedure in this video, but we will have a video linked, a little card that you can click that talks about what that process is. It's very simple. It's one extra step to make sure that you don't have a problem later on. In terms of the amount of oil I put in the engine, I put 6.75 liters, somewhere around there in. These will take 6.5 liters on a typical oil change. But because the oil pan was off and the residual in the oil pan came out, and obviously with the engine being open, dripped quite a bit of fluid out, oil pump removal, etc., it made sense to put a little bit more in. A dry start of one of these engines would be about 6.9 liters of oil, so I think 6.75 is a happy medium where it won't be overfilled, and should be on the money, but if we do need to top it up, we can do that. And while we're here, when I do this prime procedure, it's going to spin the power steering pump. So it does make sense to put some hydraulic fluid back in the system before we start it for real, and then have to bleed it out. So we'll just top this reservoir up. And we're just using the Liqui Moly central hydraulic system fluid. It is the equivalent of CHF 11S. We had a couple bottles open here in the shop, so just choosing to use that. So we've primed the engine, which, like I said, we have a little video card that you can click on to take you there to see what that procedure is. But we're gonna go ahead and put the spark plugs back in, ignition coils, hook up the injectors, all that good stuff, and start reassembling the rest of the car. So we're on the home stretch at this point. Before I put the torque wrench on these, I'm just gonna make sure that they're fully seated. Remember earlier, number 3 was a little bit of a stubborn one to get to just because of the angle. So now we're gonna go ahead and torque these spark plugs to 23 Newton meters. All right, so at this point, we will start plugging our injectors and our ignition coils back in. I'll do the injector first for the corresponding cylinder. Just want to hear a nice audible click. For our injectors, I like to push them down onto the spark plug first, then get the connector in. I like to push the connector in by hand so that the lock starts to drop down, close the gap, and then put our lock into place. Reason being is it is possible to close the lock without actually having the connector bottomed out. There we go. And then I'll wiggle the coil back and forth after it's bottomed out, just to make sure it is on the spark plug. And for the record, when you're putting the injector connectors back in, you'll see this little tab on the outside of the connector. That's going to correspond with this tab right here. That's the lock. So if you're concerned about orientation, just pay attention to that. Also, you won't be able to put it in the other way anyway. Also, some of these locks get kind of weak over time, so you can see that comes out very easily. Just make sure it's bottomed out, and then it shouldn't be a problem. Just going down the line here, making sure that everything is oriented correctly, which it is. All right, so now we have to reinstall our O2 sensor bracket, some of the pieces that hold the wiring harness in place, and we'll take it from there. I'm going to reinstall this O2 connector bracket. And these are T25s if I recall. And I'll slide the connectors back into their home here. Next up, we need to slide this thing in. It sits on a handful of grommets, so we just need to make sure that those are locked in place. And then we'll route these cables into their respective locations. Now it's secured. Next up, we'll go ahead and reinstall our intake. Just need to make sure that this rubber boot goes over. Since this car does have a mass airflow sensor, any kind of air leak is going to cause a lean condition. And then this just sort of sits on a bunch of grommets, so just push into place like so. And then over here, we have a handful of wires. Also make sure your mass airflow sensor connector is not underneath anything. You want to be able to access that and plug it in. There we go. And then while we're over here, we'll slip these cables back onto their bracket, like so. So those are set. We will tighten down this hose clamp here. It's a 6mm. Plug our mass airflow sensor in, which we hear a nice little click when it goes. We have our fresh air intake right here, which goes in the front. That clicks into place, and then we just need to line these up here, put the screws in, and then we're gonna go reinstall our strut brace here, V-brace. Just slide it through the little slot there. And get it to slide underneath the bolt in the back, which, by the way, you might recall, was sort of in rough shape. We have replaced it with a new one. E18 to the firewall, 100 Newton meters plus 100 degrees of rotation. Very interesting specification. Unfortunately, because of the damage at that portion of the strut brace from earlier, that one screw that was already stripped out, never going to be able to torque that. No matter what we do, it doesn't really seem to want to get any tighter than what it already is. So we're going to leave that alone. Went through there with a thread chaser, the whole 9 yards is what it is. We'll torque these at the strut tower though. At least that's bottomed out now. It won't make any knocking noise. At the strut towers here, our first torque sequence is 40 Newton meters. And it's E14. Our second is 60 degrees rotation. So at this point, everything's been buttoned back up. Now we're gonna start the car. And while it's running, we'll lift it up in the air, make sure that nothing's leaking from underneath. Also give us time to bleed out the power steering system, which at this point it's bled down quite a bit while sitting here. I'll turn the steering wheel back and forth, get fluid pumping through the steering rack and the power steering pump, and then we'll top off the power steering fluid after. Oil's not pouring out of it, staying inside the engine. There's no new leaks. We're good. Engine sounds healthy. We'll love to see. So, N55s and rod bearings. What conclusions do I draw from what we have in front of us here? Well, this car has 160,000 miles on it. These are the original rod bearings, and they are in fantastic condition. So again, this car has a big turbo on it. It's tuned. It's been tuned for most of its life, and there's no problems. That looks great. In fact, if anybody's looking for a lightly used, certified pre-owned rod bearings, we have them right here available for you. But really, the only thing I see is cylinder number 6. There's a couple score marks in there. Those are very superficial. Maybe a piece of dust or something or dirt got stuck in the oiling system at some point. But every single one of these rod bearings looks fantastic. I think the issue is when you look at the N55, any rod bearing failure is most likely going to be from an oil starvation situation due to either a failing oil pump, perhaps how the vehicle's being used, maybe how the vehicle's being driven, but I don't think that this is inherently a problem with the N55. Was thinking maybe we might see somewhere at 160,000 miles, but these look fantastic. And for you N55 owners out there who are afraid or concerned, sure, you could do this preventatively if you choose, but I don't think this is as much of a problem as it would be on some of your other BMW engines like the S54, the S65, or the S85 engine, just based on my observation here. So draw what conclusion you want from what you see here, but this looks very promising, especially for an early N55. All right, and that's how you go about replacing rod bearings on your E82 BMW 135i N55 powered BMW. Of course, this process can be very similar for a 3 Series equivalent, E90, E92, or E93. Hope you learned a lot in this video. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comment box below. If you like this video, hit the like button, and we always have a lot of videos on the way, so feel free to hit that subscribe button. And as always, we'll see you for the next one. Thanks for watching.